By late 1944, the once impregnable garrison on the island of Bougainville had ceased to be a strategic strongpoint of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and had transformed into a humid, rotting prison where the Imperial Japanese Army was fighting a desperate war not against the American Marines, but against the brutal, unforgiving biology of the human body itself. For Colonel Tanaka, a career logistics officer, whose mind was a carefully indexed archive of supply tables and tonnage manifests, the war had devolved from a grand chessboard of naval maneuvers into a sickening daily calculation of calories, a sliding scale where the survival of the 17th Army was measured not in territory held, but in grams of rice remaining in the damp, fungus-ridden caves that served as the headquarters. The tropical heat was a physical weight, pressing down on men whose uniforms hung loosely on skeletal frames, their ribs visible like the ridges of a washboard through the tattered cotton of their tropical tunics, while the air hung heavy with the sweet, cloying scent of decaying vegetation and the metallic tang of untreated dysentery. Tanaka sat at a makeshift desk constructed from ammunition crates, staring at the ledger that had become his Bible and his tormentor, recording the catastrophic failure of the Tokyo Express, the daring nocturnal supply runs by fast destroyers that had once kept them alive, but had now been strangled into non-existence by the tightening noose of American air and naval superiority. The Americans had bypassed them, adopting a strategy of leapfrogging that left garrisons like Tanaka's to wither on the vine, cutting off the arteries of the empire and leaving tens of thousands of men to face the terrifying specter of gato, starvation, which was killing more soldiers than American shrapnel ever could. Tanaka wiped the sweat from his forehead with a rag that was spotting with black mold, his eyes scanning the reports from the forward units that detailed the grim transition from military rations to foraging for survival, listing the consumption of lizard meat, snakes, papaya stems, and even the toxic sago palm, which required days of processing to be edible, a diet that left the men bloated with malnutrition and trembling from the onset of beriberi. He knew that the average caloric intake of his troops had plummeted below 800 calories a day, a number that spelled a slow, agonizing metabolic collapse. Yet as an officer of the emperor, his duty was to transmute this physical deprivation into spiritual steel, to convince the hollow-eyed men in the foxholes that their suffering was a form of purification that made them superior to the enemy. In his briefings, Tanaka spoke with a fervor that bordered on religious ecstasy, characterizing the Americans as soft, decadent materialists who were tethered to their supply lines like infants to a mother's breast, soldiers who would crumble if they were denied their chocolates, their cigarettes, and their warm meals, whereas the Japanese soldier, forged in the fires of Bushido and sustained by Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, could fight on nothing but water and willpower. It was a necessary lie, a psychological bulwark constructed to keep the army from dissolving into anarchy. But privately, Tanaka watched the deterioration of his equipment with the despair of a technician watching a machine grind itself to dust. The 6.5mm Arisaka rifles were pitting with rust despite the soldiers' obsessive cleaning. The leather of their boots was rotting off their feet in the constant mud, and the precious stockpile of Type 91 grenades was being hoarded like gold bullion. The silence of the ocean was the most terrifying aspect, for the horizon remained empty of the friendly silhouettes of the combined fleet, and the only vessels that appeared were the predatory shapes of U.S. Navy submarines or the distant, menacing profiles of American task forces that steamed past with impunity, ignoring the starving island as if it were already a graveyard. Tanaka watched his subordinates, men who had once marched proudly through the streets of Nanking or Singapore, now reduced to hunting rats in the undergrowth, their discipline fraying at the edges as the primal instinct to eat began to override the imperial indoctrination of obedience. He wrote letters to his family that he knew would never be sent, placing them in a tin box to protect them from the humidity, detailing not the hunger, but the glorious endurance of the garrison, maintaining the facade even to himself that this wretched existence was a noble sacrifice rather than a logistical abandonment. The tragedy of Colonel Tanaka was his absolute competence in a system that had ceased to function. He could calculate the precise burn rate of a dwindling rice stockpile to the hour. He could organize a foraging party with the tactical rigor of a flank attack, and he could ration hope just as meagerly as he rationed quinine. But he could not conjure food from the empty air. As he looked out over the jungle canopy towards the invisible American lines, he clung to the one belief that kept him sane, that while the enemy might have more ships, more planes, and more bullets, they could never match the Japanese capacity for suffering, and that this spiritual hardening was the ultimate weapon that would eventually turn the tide of the war. Unaware that just over the horizon, the United States Navy was preparing to deploy a weapon that would shatter this worldview not with explosives, but with a display of logistical excess so profound it would make his starving army's sacrifice look not noble, but pitifully futile.
While the soldiers of the Japanese Empire were scraping the jungle floor for sustenance, a universe away in the industrial sprawl of National City, California, a project was nearing completion that represented the absolute zenith of American logistical arrogance. A vessel that was not designed to fire shells or launch aircraft, but was built with the singular, fanatical purpose of manufacturing joy on an industrial scale. The directive had come straight from the top, from the office of Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who had codified a doctrine that sounded almost insane in the context of global slaughter, that ice cream was not merely a dessert, but a strategic munition, a vital psychological component of the American way of life that had to be projected across the Pacific alongside the dive bombers and the flamethrowers to ensure that the morale of the sailor did not disintegrate under the tropical sun. However, the construction of this morale machine faced a critical bottleneck that would have stopped any other nation, which was the scarcity of steel, a resource so precious it was allocated exclusively for the hulls of destroyers and the armor of tanks, leaving none for a floating dairy parlor. The solution arrived at by the naval engineers was a testament to the brute force of American ingenuity and the limitless resources at their disposal. If they could not build it out of steel, they would build it out of rock, leading to the birth of the RBL, Barge, Refrigerated, Large, a class of vessel that the dockyard workers, shaking their heads in disbelief at the extravagance of their own government, affectionately christened the Concrete Cow. In the dry docks of the Concrete Ship Constructors Company, laborers poured thousands of tons of wet cement into massive wooden forms, casting a monolithic hull 265 feet long that looked more like a floating bunker than a ship, a gray, ugly slab of geometry that possessed no engines, no rudder, and no wheelhouse, designed to be towed like a stubborn beast of burden across the ocean. But the crude exterior hid an interior of sophisticated technological excess that rivaled the complexity of a submarine. For inside the concrete belly, which provided excellent thermal insulation against the equatorial heat, the Navy installed a refrigeration plant of staggering power, a labyrinth of copper piping and heavy-duty compressors circulating Freon gas to create a localized Arctic climate in the middle of the tropics. The heart of the vessel was the manufacturing deck, a gleaming sanitary factory floor where stainless steel churns and flash freezers hummed with the electric rhythm of mass production, designed to ingest powdered milk, sugar, and flavorings and transmute them into 500 gallons of ice cream every single hour, a production rate that meant this single barge could outproduce the entire dairy output of many small nations. The cost of this single vessel was astronomical, reaching $1 million in 1945 currency, a sum that could have purchased platoons of tanks or squadrons of fighter planes, yet the Pentagon signed the checks without hesitation, viewing the expense as a necessary investment in the mental health of the fleet. As the final fittings were installed, technicians calibrated the thermostats and tested the storage lockers, which were capable of holding 1,500 tons of frozen meat and produce in addition to the ice cream, turning the barge into a floating cornucopia that mocked the very concept of scarcity. The workers installed industrial mixers capable of blending hundreds of gallons of vanilla and chocolate, the only two standard flavors sanctioned for mass distribution, creating a surreal juxtaposition where the machinery of war was repurposed for the machinery of comfort. To the naval architects reviewing the blueprints, the RBL was a triumph of engineering, solving the problem of feeding 1 million men thousands of miles from home. But to an observer thinking in terms of pure survival, the Concrete Cow was something far more terrifying. It was a declaration that the United States had effectively solved the problem of the war's material demands to such a degree that they could afford to engage in the luxury of excess. While the Japanese were melting down temple bells to make bullets, the Americans were pouring concrete to make freezers. And as the barge was floated out of the dry dock, sitting low and heavy in the water, it represented a logistical disparity so vast that it ceased to be a conflict between armies and became conflict between eras, the medieval scarcity of the Axis powers versus the futuristic abundance of the Allies. The tugboats hooked up their hawsers to the concrete behemoth, beginning the slow, plodding journey west toward the violently contested waters of the Pacific, dragging with them $1 million factory that would serve as the ultimate insult to an enemy dying of hunger.
proving that for the United States Navy, the conquest of the Pacific was not just about securing islands, but about ensuring that a 19-year-old machinist's mate from Iowa could have a scoop of cold, sweet vanilla while watching the smoke rise from a bombarded shoreline. By early 1945, the Ulithi Atoll had transformed from a submerged volcanic crater into the third largest naval anchorage in the world, a secret city floating on the turquoise waters of the Caroline Islands, where the United States Navy hid the clenched fist of its Pacific Fleet between strikes against the Japanese homeland. To aviation machinist's mate First Class Mike Grease Kowalski, standing on the flight deck of an Essex-class carrier that was still radiating the heat of a 3-day combat cycle, the lagoon was a vista of staggering industrial density, crowded with over 600 ships ranging from the behemoth carriers of Murderers Row to the endless chain of oilers and supply tenders that kept the war machine fed. Mike's hands were permanently stained with hydraulic fluid, and his ears rang with the phantom roar of Hellcat engines, a somatic reminder of the relentless sorties flown against Okinawa. But today, the schedule did not call for loading bombs or changing spark plugs, but for a rotation to the Geedunk, the most surreal destination in the entire theater of war. He boarded a Liberty launch with 20 other sailors, men who looked like hollowed-out ghosts with sunburned noses, their dungarees bleached white by salt and sweat, sitting in silence as the small boat navigated the maze of gray steel hulls, passing battleships that bristled with 16-inch guns capable of leveling cities, until they approached a vessel that looked like it had been carved by a child out of a sidewalk slab. It was the BRL, the concrete ice cream barge, sitting low and ugly in the water, a geometric anomaly amidst the sleek lines of the destroyers. Yet as the launch pulled alongside, the sailors straightened up, their eyes widening not at a threat, but at the impossible sensation of cold air spilling from the open cargo doors. Stepping onto the barge was like stepping through a portal from the equatorial hell of the Pacific back to a Sunday afternoon in Brooklyn, for the air inside was conditioned to a crisp, dried chill that instantly dried the sweat on my neck, and the smell of the place was a disorientation of the senses. Gone was the pervasive stench of bunker fuel, cordite, and unwashed bodies, replaced by the overwhelming, sugary aroma of vanilla extract and condensed milk. The interior was a humming factory of stainless steel and white enamel, where massive churns rotated with a hypnotic rhythm, powered by generators that thrummed deep in the concrete belly, processing the powdery mix that the Quartermaster Corps had shipped halfway around the world. Mike joined the line that snaked through the serving deck, clutching his ration ticket like a holy relic, watching as the soda jerks, sailors whose battle station was literally a serving counter, dispensed the frozen product into wax paper cups with the efficiency of an assembly line. When it was his turn, the server handed him a quart of vanilla, the sides of the container frosting over in the humidity, and Mike shoveled the first spoon into his mouth, the shock of the cold causing a momentary headache that felt better than any morphine. The taste was rich, creamy, and impossibly smooth, a sensory experience that short-circuited the fear centers of his brain and transported him back to the corner drugstores of civilian life, effectively erasing the terror of the kamikaze attacks he had witnessed just 48 hours prior. Around him, hundreds of other men sat on crates and leaned against the bulkheads, eating their ice cream in a reverent silence that was broken only by the scrape of wooden spoons, their faces softening as the sugar rushed into their bloodstreams, momentarily turned hardened killers back into teenagers. This was the genius of the American war effort, a realization that hit Mike as he scraped the bottom of his cup. The Navy didn't just give them bullets to fight with, it gave them a piece of home to fight for, creating a psychological bubble where the war felt less like a desperate struggle for survival and more like a dangerous job that one commuted to, complete with lunch breaks and perks. The barge produced 500 gallons every hour, a ceaseless river of comfort that flowed out to the destroyers and cruisers, a logistical flex that declared that the United States could conquer the Pacific without sacrificing the standard of living of its citizens. As Mike stepped back out into the blinding glare of the tropical sun, the sugar sitting heavy and comforting in his stomach, he looked across the lagoon at the distant horizon, where the Japanese were starving and dying for their emperor, and he felt a strange, cold pity for them, knowing that they were fighting a force that could pave the ocean with concrete and freeze the tropics just to get a mechanic a 10-minute break. He wiped his mouth, the taste of vanilla lingering as a reminder that he was backed by a system that considered his happiness a strategic imperative, and with his morale artificially inflated by the calculated application of carbohydrates and refrigeration, he boarded the launch to go back to the carrier, ready to load bombs once again.
The realization of total defeat did not arrive for Colonel Tanaka in the form of a mushroom cloud or a massive amphibious landing, but rather in the damp, claustrophobic silence of a subterranean command bunker on the south tip of Formosa, where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the burning oil of a single flickering lamp. It was late May 1945, and the Imperial Japanese Army was disintegrating across the Pacific. Yet the intelligence officers of the Section 2 staff still dutifully collected and analyzed the debris of war, sifting through the pockets of dead American aviators and the waterlogged satchels recovered from washed-up flight jackets in search of tactical data. On this particular sweltering afternoon, Captain Sato, a young intelligence officer whose face was gaunt from months of half rations, placed a recovered document on Tanaka's desk with a trembling hand, presenting not a map of invasion routes or a codebook, but a mundane, crumpled copy of a plan of the day from a U.S. Navy heavy cruiser recovered from the wreckage of a downed seaplane tender. Tanaka adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, which sat loosely on his nose due to the weight he had lost, and began to read the translated schedule, his eyes scanning past the duty rosters and gunnery drills until they stopped at a line item scheduled for 1400 hours. Recreation party. Ice cream issue from BRL, Barge number 3. Tanaka stared at the characters, the concept refusing to seat itself in his mind, and he asked Sato if this was a mistranslation, or perhaps a code word for a new type of explosive or fuel. But Sato shook his head with a grim certainty, producing a supplementary American technical manual captured months earlier that listed naval acronyms, pointing a dirty fingernail at the entry for BRL, Barge, Refrigerated, Large. The room fell into a silence that was heavier than the stone walls surrounding them as the officers attempted to process the thermodynamic implications of the sentence. Tanaka, ever the logistician, began to mentally reverse engineer the supply chain required to put a scoop of frozen dairy into the hand of a sailor in the middle of the tropics, and the calculation terrified him more than the B-29s flying overhead. He realized that to produce ice cream at sea, the enemy needed not just the raw ingredients of powdered milk and sugar, commodities that had vanished from Japan years ago, but they needed a massive, uninterrupted chain of refrigeration, starting from the dairy farms of Wisconsin, traveling by rail to the west coast, and then crossing 3,000 miles of contested ocean in vessels dedicated solely to preservation. He calculated the fuel required to run the compressors, the tonnage of steel and concrete used to build the barge, and the sheer audacity of a naval command that would allocate shipping lanes for dessert while the Japanese Navy was stripping the copper wiring out of schools just to build fire control circuits. Sato whispered that the barge described in the manual cost approximately $1 million American dollars and was capable of producing 500 gallons an hour, a statistic that hit Tanaka like a physical blow to the stomach. He looked down at his own desk, where his dinner awaited him, a bowl of watery gruel mixed with sweet potato vines, and a small dried lizard that his adjutant had caught on the bunker wall, a meal that represented the absolute limit of their logistical capacity. The disparity was no longer military, it was civilizational. The Americans were not merely winning, they were operating in a post-scarcity reality where the laws of war, which dictated that resources must be conserved for lethality, did not apply. Tanaka realized that while he was exhorting his men to die for the emperor with empty bellies, claiming that their spiritual purity would overcome the enemy's material numbers, the enemy was treating the war zone like a floating country club. The psychological impact was devastating because it dismantled the core tenet of Japanese propaganda, the idea that the Americans were soft and would crumble under hardship. Tanaka realized with a chilling clarity that the Americans did not need to endure hardship because they had engineered it out of existence. They had built a machine so efficient that it could export the luxury of a Sunday afternoon picnic to the gates of hell. He felt the foundations of his worldview crack, understanding that the divine wind could not blow against a nation that could afford to spend $1 million on a concrete barge just to keep its soldiers cool. The plan of the day was not just a schedule, it was a death sentence for the empire, proof that they were fighting a war against a force of nature that had mastered the logistics of abundance so thoroughly that they could crush Japan without ever feeling the pang of hunger. Tanaka dismissed Sato and sat alone in the dim light, staring at the document, the cold logic of the ice cream barge settling into his bones, telling him that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the factory, and that no amount of samurai spirit could compete with a logistical system that could freeze water in the middle of a burning ocean.
The surrender ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri had been a spectacle of gold braid and grim silence, but the true autopsy of the Imperial Japanese Empire did not take place under the guns of a battleship, but rather in the ruined, ash-choked conference rooms of Tokyo in the autumn of 1946, where the surviving architects of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere sat opposite their American conquerors to explain how a nation of divine warriors had been dismantled by a nation of shopkeepers. For General Tanaka, stripped of his sword and wearing a suit that hung loosely on his malnourished frame, the humiliation was not in the military defeat itself, for a warrior accepts that fortune in battle is fickle, but in the dawning realization of the logistical chasm that had separated the two belligerents.
a realization that crystallized during a debriefing with Colonel Miller of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. The conversation had drifted from the strategic failures of Midway and Leyte Gulf to the mundane topic of supply chains, and Miller, in a moment of casual transparency, laid out the production statistics of the American war effort, sliding a report across the table that detailed the deployment of the BRL, the concrete ice cream barges, to the forward areas of the Pacific Theater. Tanaka read the figures with a stoicism that masked an internal collapse, his eyes fixing on the data point that the U.S. Navy had produced over 65 million gallons of ice cream in 1945 alone, a volume of frozen confection that exceeded the total tonnage of aviation fuel Japan had managed to refine in the final year of the war. The revelation was a vertigo-inducing shift in perspective, forcing Tanaka to confront the terrifying truth that while his soldiers on Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima were being told to eat grass and drink their own urine to sustain the emperor's will, the American military was expending nearly $1 million per vessel to construct floating concrete factories dedicated solely to the production of strawberry and vanilla treats. He realized then that the American strategy had not been one of brilliance, but of suffocation through abundance, a method of warfare where the enemy did not just defeat you, they outspent, outproduced, and outconsumed you until your entire worldview collapsed under their weight of their excess. The softness that the Japanese propaganda had mocked, the American soldiers' need for cigarettes, magazines, and cold desserts, was not a weakness, but a flex of industrial muscle so powerful it was incomprehensible to a nation that had been sewing uniforms out of paper. Tanaka looked out the window at the flattened expanse of Tokyo, where civilians were currently scavenging through garbage cans for fish heads, and he understood that the war had been over long before the atomic bombs fell. It had ended the moment the Americans decided they could afford to pave the ocean with concrete refrigerators. The ice cream barge was the ultimate insult, a weapon psychologically more devastating than the B-29, because it proved that the United States could fight a total war without ever altering its fundamental standard of living, while Japan had cannibalized its own society down to the brass doorknobs just to keep fighting. The verdict of history, Tanaka realized, would not focus on the bravery of the kamikaze or the tactical genius of Yamamoto, but on the cold, hard math of logistics, which dictated that a nation capable of serving chilled dairy products in the middle of a tropical combat zone could never be defeated by a nation that could not even feed its own defenders. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes, the story of the concrete barges became a quiet legend among the surviving generation, a bitter parable about the folly of confusing spiritual strength with industrial capacity. The physical barges themselves were eventually towed away, some repurposed for commercial fishing or sunk as breakwaters, their million-dollar freezing plants rusting into the coral reefs. But their legacy remained as a ghostly monument to the cold logic of the American victory. As the interrogation ended and Tanaka rose to leave, he bowed not to Colonel Miller, but to the terrifying efficiency of the system Miller represented, acknowledging that the samurai sword had been shattered not by another sword, but by a scoop of ice cream, served cold in a paper cup 4,000 miles from home, proving for all to see that in the modern age, the army that can deliver luxury to the front line is the army that will inevitably rule the world.